So, another day and another spurious way The Guardian can draw connections between two things it really doesn't like, in a bid to slander at least half of the human population. I think they do this with a dartboard. They have a dartboard full of things they don't like. They throw two darts, and whatever comes up, they run with as their headline. In this case, men are responsible for all of climate change, and women are the only thing that can solve it. This is the contention of a couple of different pieces in The Guardian this week, which we will go through, beginning with this here. The world designed by men has destroyed many things, COP26 warned by self-hating man Damien Carrington. The climate crisis, says, cannot be ended without the empowerment of women, politicians and campaigners. The world as designed by men has destroyed many things, COP26 delegates have been told, as leaders and campaigners, all of whom flew in on luxury jets to stay in air-conditioned apartments and being very comfortably off with access to food on demand and clean running water, and public transport and civilization generally. No, all of this is rubbish. Anyway, the leaders and campaigners warned that the climate crisis could not be ended without the empowerment of women. Women and girls, The Guardian say, around the world suffer disproportionately from the impact of climate breakdown, as they are on average poorer, less educated and more dependent on subsistence farming. A UN report found 80% of those displaced by the climate emergency are women. The solution the people in COP26 advocate, and The Guardian does as well, is the solution they advocate for all of these problems. You throw money at it. Throw money at cultures where women have been historically disempowered for millennia, because we don't recognise that actually the state of female empowerment in the West is an aberration. It is the exception, not the rule throughout the world. It's a relatively modern phenomenon, and most of the world has not caught up, though, of course, they encourage us to learn lessons from the rest of the world when it comes to solving climate change. More money, though, will solve the problem. You can overturn millennia of cultural attitudes toward women with money, apparently. The focus on gender equality on Tuesday saw Indigenous women and politicians, including Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon and Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the US House of Representatives, demand increased investment. Nancy Pelosi is, I think, at this point, purely just a fossil. She is made of carbon. And that's it. I mean, she belongs in the Smithsonian, and if you put her in the Smithsonian in a glass case, you'd probably contain some of the emissions that she produces. The unfortunately named Angelica Ponce, Executive Director of the Plurinational Authority for Mother Earth in Bolivia, which sounds like a very sensible organisation, said, "The world is designed by men has destroyed many things. The world should begin thinking like women. If it was designed by a woman, it would end violence against women and children." This is a common myth, and it is completely untrue. I mean, there is simply no evidence. There have been female leaders in the world. There have been a fair few female leaders in the world. Nowhere near as many as there have been male leaders in the world, of course, for reasons previously stated. But there have been plenty of female rulers, and of those female rulers, there is no evidence to say that women being in charge leads to a more peaceful, collaborative, international community. There is simply not. Women, I think, are on average more bloodlust. They have more bloodlust as leaders. They are more bloodthirsty as leaders, and I think, I'd have to find the study, but I did read one a little while ago that showed, in fact, they are more likely to go to war with each other than male leaders are. And if you remember what it's like being at school, if you remember what the teenage girls you were at school with were like, you can understand why. Women are, generally speaking, not very nice, especially to each other. So this idea that empowering women is a way to solve the problem of violence against women or women being displaced by climate change is bunk. We want to be in the corridors of power and to take part in decisions at international level to end this struggle of climate justice, she says. As Indigenous women, we live day by day the cruel reality of climate change in our land. Another Indigenous woman, Nicola Sturgeon, said, "When world leaders gathered here last week, of the 120 or so, a tiny minority were women. That needs to change, and it needs to change quickly. There is no doubt we must ensure that climate change is a feminist issue. But women are not pleading to be supported, we're demanding to be empowered." Well, you can empower yourself, surely, if you're not pleading for support in this matter. I think men should support women in gaining more power. Personally, I'm relatively old-fashioned in that regard. I'm an old-fashioned feminist. But apparently, no. Male support is unnecessary. They're not asking for support. They are demanding to be empowered, in which case, do it your damn self. The men do, generally speaking. Or at least that's what we're led to believe. Nicola Sturgeon is an interesting one and not an especially good example to be set here. Obviously, here as in the Winsford Guardian reports, I don't know where Winsford and Middlewich, which I think is a John Wyndham novel. Nicola Sturgeon calls for women to be at the centre of the climate change fight. I'm not going to complete your survey. I should have done this before. Well, in Nicola Sturgeon, empowered. Obviously, she's demanding that they be empowered. What's her actual commitment, however? Because as soon as my browser is unfrozen, we can see the extent of Nicola Sturgeon's commitment to tackling the cause of climate change. Nicola Sturgeon's SNP government has pledged £1 million for the fund for climate loss and damage. £1 million. This is a woman who is the head of the SNP government that pretends that when Scotland goes independent, they will be leading on the world stage. They will have full control of their economy, they'll have full control of their finances, they won't step back, they won't be impoverished, they won't be held back by the evil union anymore, though we subsidise them, so what the extent we're holding them back I don't really know. But this independent Scotland is pledging £1 million to fund mitigation against climate loss and prevention. As ITV reported, she pledged a £1 million fund to help developing countries deal with loss and damage from climate change, such as floods and wildfires. The First Minister will make the announcement at a meeting in COP26's Green Zone on Monday. We don't have the resources of other Western governments, but we can lead by example, she will say, which is a rare admission of fact from Nicola Sturgeon, because even as part of the United Kingdom, from which it gains a generous dividend, Scotland is the poorest country in Europe, I believe. If it were to go independent, it would certainly be the poorest country in Europe. Its deficit is above the level that Greece's deficit was at when the Germans imposed pseudo austerity on them. So it's nice to hear the First Minister acknowledge that she doesn't have the resources of other Western governments, and that will not be improved by cutting yourself off from a union which subsidises your people and your public services. The money will come from the Scottish Government's £6 million a year Climate Justice Fund, helping communities repair from and build resilience against climate-related events. Ms Sturgeon is due to speak at a meeting of the Global Citizens Assembly on Monday. I believe that's already happened, but because I have a life and I cannot abide listening to Nicola Sturgeon unless I'm paid to do it, I didn't watch. But nevertheless, how far do you think £1 million fund is going to go? How far do you think £1 million fund is going to go in solving the supposedly catastrophic damage of climate change? Just, how many people do you think it'll help? How much damage will it mitigate? How many flood defences will it build? How many farms will it build? How much equipment will it provide? £1 million, and we're told that the vast majority of the people who will suffer from climate change includes the vast majority of the world population in total, all of whom who live in very poor areas in need of support. £1 million is not going to do anything. Pledging £1 million is not leadership. How many women, Nicola Sturgeon, will you help by pledging your £1 million? 5, maybe? I can't think it would be very many more than that. It also doesn't, of course, say yet where exactly and how the money's going to be spent, but it's almost irrelevant because it is such a small sum, given the scale of the crisis we are told that we face. Nicola Sturgeon is not really doing very much for the empowerment of women here. Surely put your money where your mouth is, Miss Sturgeon. We await, of course. It's going to be a long wait, I suspect. But the principal bugbear this week is another Guardian article, and if I can get rid of the bit where they beg you for money, because they are of the left. Yes, a nonsense, actually insane article from someone called Maria Tanyag. We need more female leaders in the fight against climate change. Diverse participation leads to more robust solutions, but COP26 shows we are still failing to include marginalised voices, she says. In a stirring speech at the opening of the COP26 World Leaders Summit, Mia Mottley, Prime Minister of Barbados, asked, when will leaders lead? The problem she identified is that both ambition and needed faces are not present in Glasgow. The overrepresentation of white men in climate change decision-making processes is stifling for both the imagination and the implementation of transformative solutions. Globally, only 26 women serve as heads of government in state, she writes. At the last COP summit held in 2019, approximately 80%, or 155 of the 196 heads of delegation, were men. Progress has been made to increase women's participation in COP events, but gender parity in climate leadership is estimated to be achieved only in 2068. Well, empower yourselves. That's what Nicola Sturgeon advocates. She is demanding empowerment. So get on it, ladies. What's the excuse? You can't wait for the men to do it for you, obviously. Miss Tanya continues, the global climate change agenda has met with not only political inaction but resistance in the form of populist denialism that threatens to derail or undo existing efforts. For example, studies on conservative white males, which one gets the impression reading articles from The Guardian like this, which cite studies on conservative white males, that The Guardian thinks they're essentially akin to bonobos or chimps that you might study in a zoo. Anyway, studies on conservative white males in the US and Norway have highlighted the connection between climate change denialism, patriarchal beliefs, and right-wing nationalism. Well, there may well be a correlation there. It wouldn't surprise me at all. People on the right tend to be opposed to massive campaigns to enlarge the size of the state. Generally speaking, people on the political right don't like enlarging the size of the state. But enlarging the size of the state is almost a consensus response to the problems we supposedly face from climate change. Now, of course, then there is a correlation. If you oppose massive tax increases on people who can't afford it, to fund governments which are incompetent and unable to act, to fund projects which have no evidential basis behind them and which in fact in many cases do more harm than good in the fight against climate change, then yeah, there's a link between being right-wing nationalist and climate so-called denialism. Climate change denialism is an incredibly broad and silly nonsense term, designed almost exclusively to invoke the kind of opprobrium one hears whenever one is described as a Holocaust denier. Very few people, I would wager, of the people here cited, would actually deny that the climate is changing. Very few people who are branded climate change deniers deny that the climate is changing. What they deny is that the efforts prescribed by people like Nicola Sturgeon, by people at COP26, by governments worldwide, are the proper and right solution to that problem. You can accept that climate is changing, but disagree with the agenda, and you will still be branded a climate change denier. It's a very loose term, which makes it not particularly useful when studies link it with patriarchal beliefs, again, an incredibly broad topic. Who are we talking about? What beliefs are we talking about? And right-wing nationalism. I'm going to keep forgetting her name. Miss Tanyak continues, people who directly benefit from the status quo are more likely to feel threatened by the kind of political, economic and societal overhaul that solutions to climate change require. Rather than collaboration, Donald Trump's withdrawal in 2020 from the Paris Agreement is arguably the conservative white male effect writ large. Now, a few things wrong here, as you might expect. In the first place, it is highly debatable whether what she thinks are the solutions to climate change require are in fact required. I suspect, given that she writes for The Guardian, she'll be very fond, for instance, of windmills, and she'll be very fond, for instance, of solar panels, neither of which provide anything like the amount of energy we're going to need to power our climate transition that the government says it wants to enact. There was a study done, a good piece actually by Christopher Snowdon in The Critic not too long ago, Christopher Snowdon of the Institute of Economic Affairs, and he explained that to meet the government's targets, for instance, for usage of electric cars, we will need to triple our total energy usage by 2030. At the same time, we're making a transition to renewable, supposedly, forms of energy generation, wind and solar, which on good years can only provide a total of 25% of our energy. So we're trying to triple our energy needs whilst downgrading to a supply which only provides a quarter of our current energy needs. And there is a limit to how much you can do with wind and with solar. And it also turns out, Michael Schellenberger is very good on this point, that wind and solar are nowhere near as climate friendly as they were billed to be. It was a massive underestimate for the environmental damage done, for instance, by the discarding of outdated solar panels, because solar panels go out of date, they need to be replaced. By and large, the old panels end up on landfills in countries where they're allowed to be. In this country, they are too toxic, and in America, they are too toxic to be placed in landfills. So they're often exported to countries where no landfills exist, placed on landfills, and then they go about poisoning the water supplies of poor villagers. So how's that for empowering indigenous women? So that would be one. The argument made often at COP26, and we covered this in a previous video, that we need system change, not climate change, that socialism is the answer to the climate change crisis, is again not borne out by facts. It is highly contentious. I would also suggest it is highly wrong, given that most of the innovations that show the most promise for actually doing something about climate change, from carbon capture technology to new, more efficient battery technology to new electric cars, are all coming from the private sector. We would have to hope as well that we get back into the nuclear business in a real and proper way. There has been some positive move by the government recently. They're going to attempt to roll out a number of miniature nuclear power plants, which will power several 100 million homes, I think, by 2030, which is a realistic way of tackling a problem. That's a very good way of tackling the problem. But the Guardian's, generally speaking, not big on nuclear either. The argument, of course, that socialism is required when the private sector is already doing the job, is already also doing the job of decarbonising fuels and has been doing so since the Victorian era in this country, socialism doesn't have a very good record on this issue, wherever it has been tried, in whatever form it has been tried. China is, on the one hand, talking big about its commitments against climate change, but it's not estimated to peak in its climate emissions, its carbon emissions, until 2030. So we're supposed to have worldwide cut our emissions by the year, on the same year the Chinese will have hit their peak. They're currently opening new coal-fired power stations at an astonishing rate. Meanwhile, our MPs are telling us that we should try celebrating Christmas with a few fewer fairy lights blaring, which I don't think is going to make up the difference. But so the argument that socialism is going to be the answer to this, when all of the evidence against central economic planning is in, it's not even contentious anymore. Anyone who cares to learn this stuff can learn it. There is no sound case, socially, morally, or economically, for imposing socialism on people in an attempt to solve any problem save a life expectancy that is too high or too readily available food sources. That's the only thing socialism is good at cutting down. And she cites Donald Trump's withdrawal in 2020 from the Paris Agreement as arguably the conservative white male effect writ large, but after that withdrawal, the United States continued cutting its carbon emissions. Why did it do so? Because Donald Trump expanded the availability of fracking and took away a large number of the protections on large parts of land to enable more fracking to take place. Shale gas is much more carbon efficient than other forms of gas, and certainly than oil is. And by leaving it to the states, which is what that withdrawal in fact amounted to, his administration stood back. It said, this isn't actually the government's job. It's certainly not the federal government's job. Stood back, and climate emissions continued to fall in the United States. Now, Joe Biden has reinstituted land protections, has taken a much harder line on fracking. As a result, the United States is no longer energy independent and is having to import at great expense in money, and in climate emissions, carbon emissions, from abroad, from the Middle East again, in the form of oil and other dirty forms of fuel. So it might be the conservative white male effect writ large. But if it is the case, then the conservative white male effect writ large was actually rather good for the environment, which is an irony which typically for a Guardian writer has escaped her. She continues, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change came into force in 1994. Since then, the convention has generated complex global governance processes, institutions and actors, with gender equality now widely recognised as core to the climate change agenda. This is a very good argument against imposing socialism or socialistic style models, because gender equality is not going to solve carbon emissions. How is that going to be a thing? How? Just how? The first reference to gender balance, she continues, appeared in the outcome document of COP7 in 2001. By COP25 in 2019, states had agreed to strengthen efforts toward gender-responsive climate action. This is just buzzwords. It's meaningless buzzwords. It's an awful lot of time, effort, money and attention that could be put to solving the real problems of climate change, but is instead being turned towards solving the pet political problems of female activists. It's essentially what's happening. She continues, however, women are still underrepresented in climate change negotiations, as shown in the UNFCCC Secretariat report presented at COP26. As well as finding that women remain in the minority and are less likely to lead a government delegation, it also analysed speaking times at selected COP25 meetings to provide insights on active participation. It found that men were overrepresented in terms of presence and tended to speak more than women. Oh dear. I mean, I tend to think that people at COP, the general problem is there are too many people at COP spending too long speaking, not enough action doing things. It's the one thing on which I agree with Greta Thunberg, or one of the few things on which I agree with Greta Thunberg. I don't think women saying useless things in a more balanced way, or a better gender balance of people saying useless things at COP26 meetings, for instance, is going to make a huge amount of difference. Women tend to do better in terms of representation and participation in the civil society sector. Research shows that women occupy a larger share of NGO representatives to each COP than their government delegate counterparts. Allowing civil society groups to play a direct role in climate negotiations creates space for diverse perspectives and forms of expertise. It also makes the thing practically unwieldy and unmanageable. It's like one of those citizens' assemblies, which try and get lots and lots of people in the room without very much vetting to all vent their opinions, and again accomplishes next to nothing. It's just a hate chamber. It's just people screaming out the clouds. That's all these kind of things accomplish. It's important because, she says, when decision-making processes incorporate gender perspectives, the meaningful participation by women, solutions are often more comprehensive and durable. One study found female representation in national parliaments across 91 countries correlates with the more stringent climate change policies and lower carbon emissions. This reinforces evidence that gender equality improves societal outcomes in relation to the environment and peace-building efforts. Well, no. Again, what she defines as restrictive climate measures are not necessarily measures which are going to do very much to solve climate change. Hefty tax bills on domestic flights, for instance, it's debatable how much good that will do. Hefty government subsidies for wind and solar, again, doesn't do very much good. Huge tax hikes on the middle class, which can all be passed as stringent climate policy, not a good idea, turns people off, doesn't actually have any meaningful effect other than to make people poorer. And attempts to control corporations and pension funds and investors in terms of making certain investment classes and asset classes untenable or unholdable, dirty asset classes, again achieve the countervailing effect. There have been few people profiting more from the current purge of oil and gas companies from, say, pension funds than hedge funds, who are already owned by very rich people. A massive transfer of wealth, unreported, has gone from the poorest to the richest as the government's increased taxes on the middle class, attempt to stop investment in dirty kinds of oil and energy production, and so doing drive up the price of those stocks because there will always be somebody willing to buy. Now, the author, whose name I can't be bothered to remember, says earlier that people who have an interest, people who have a stake in society, people who are already established, people who already have power, are of course going to react negatively to attempts to overthrow the system that has empowered them. Well, take it from me, I'm not a particularly powerful person. I am a white male, but that's about the only way I think in which I can fall into any kind of convention. I'm not rich at all, actually. I'm in my overdraft at the end of every payslip. Never have been rich. I started buying stock only after all this started happening, and I started buying stocks in dirty companies because, lo and behold, they go up. So, airlines, buy those. Oil and gas, buy those. Tobacco, usually pretty good. Arms manufacturers, we will never be in a world free of war. It's utopian to believe otherwise. Another good thing to invest in. I am not the only person doing this. If I'm making money from it, hedge funds are making lots more money from it. Rich people are doing very well out of this, and the entire cost, the entire burden of it, is, as is always the case with left-wing economic policies, left-wing social policies, falling on the poorest in society. And that includes women, funnily enough. Rethinking who leads us in addressing the climate crisis and how requires recognition of expertise and leadership from the most climate-affected parts of Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean, Asia and the Pacific. Environmental factors already limit the participation of people from these regions. Yep, that's true. Can't really do much about that though, unless you want to start levelling mountain ranges or making unnavigable rivers navigable. Emerging accounts show female community leaders struggle to participate in climate activism due to weather, distance and transport needs. In addition to their care responsibilities, again, there is also the slight sort of testy subject in Islamic societies of the place of women there. Very unconventional to have female rulers in Islamic societies. Most traditionalistic, tribalistic societies are not maternal, they are paternal. It's another way in which sort of the history of Northern Europe is unique. We were quite a maternalistic society in a way that's not replicated in large parts of the world, which he cites here. It simply has never been the case. Again, the state of gender balance in the West, the modern West, is a remarkable achievement, and it's not the norm. It's not a failure which produces an aberrant result that the rest of the world hasn't caught up. The rest of the world hasn't caught up because that's where we started from. We ought to be pursuing more of the things that the West has done well, rather than turning to what the West has done and saying that is destroying the world. If you want to empower women, look to the West. The West is the thing to do. The West is the place to emulate. I found in my own research that the lack of diversity at UN climate summits is both a cause and effect of securitization and scientization of climate... What? Scientization? Another made-up word of climate change. Dr. Sherilyn McGregor of the University of Manchester argues that climate change has been represented both as a scientific problem and as a threat to security. Well, this is surely true in both cases, no? I mean, you can debate whether it's a real security issue. You have to accept that there will be the argument that there will be tens of millions, if not billions, of people displaced, leading to extra wars and demands for resources in cash-strapped Middle Eastern societies, for instance, in third world countries. If you accept that, it is a security threat. There are reasons to doubt it. But anyway, science and security have been traditionally male domains, where knowledge production and validation have been seen as the territory of a very narrow and male-centric set of knowers. My God, this is just... Postmodernism is a cancer. I mean, how do you propose the only possible way of solving the problems identified here in terms of climate change in particular are via science? That's how we know that there is climate change in the first place. All these horribly male domains where knowledge production and validation the territory of a very narrow and male-centric set of knowers, has A, allowed us to discover climate change, B, allowed us to discover the rate of it, C, allowed us to discover the cause of it, and D, allowed us to discover what we have so far discovered of the solutions to the problem. That, like, why would you attack this simply because there are too few women's there? Like, what if it's doing a job and it's doing it well, then it's doing a job and it's doing it well. We don't need affirmative action for women. There are great female scientists. There are huge numbers of great female scientists. There always have been. There have been many who've shamefully gone unknown and unreported on because they were kept out of the awards listings for the accomplishments they made, which were claimed by men. That's an undoubted fact, and it's an undoubted injustice. Nevertheless, that's not an attack on science in the way that this person seems to think that it is. Science isn't undermined by a lower participation of females in science. And given the amount of money we've attempted to spend getting more girls into STEM subjects, which seems to have reached a cap at this point, there is no, you can spend as much money as you like, and you can't seem to break this cap that exists on female interest in the sciences, then you have to start wondering whether that chap at Google, was it Demore? Very confident about the sort of innate interests of the sexes, has some basis in fact. But you don't really need to take a position either side on that, to simply say, so what? Like, if science is doing its job, if science is doing the job well, and women aren't there, then it doesn't need women to be better. That's just true. I'm all for more women getting involved if they want to be, but it won't necessarily improve the sciences. There are only so many perspectives you can have on the rudimentaries of science. Having more women in the room does not change the fact that 1 + 1 = 2, unless all of those women come from social science degrees, which a disproportionate number of them do. Unless the way our global leaders frame the climate crisis changes, we will continue to force women's participation to fit within very rigid sets of expertise, procedures, and diplomatic styles that do not lend themselves to creating radical global and systemic change, the author, Miss Tanyak, says. And we will continue to witness global leaders lagging far behind the monumental task of ensuring humanity's survival. Has never once in this article shown why more women in the room will actually make a difference, certainly in the context of science. Rigid sets of expertise, yes, ideally people who are responsible for setting climate change policy and for studying climate change and for studying the solutions of climate change will have expertise. That's a good idea. I don't think expertise should be devalued compared to sex. I don't think sex is more important than expertise. I don't think you should think that either. It's postmodernist bilge, it's claptrap, it's nonsense to suggest otherwise. All this is just weird postmodernist intersectional feminist griping at their absence from decision-making tables that no one is actively preventing them from in the West. Their problems, if they want to have more indigenous, aboriginal, or minority women in power, are with the cultures those women come from, and they won't be solved by the West throwing ever more money at the problem, and they certainly won't be solved by saying that science is by definition invalid or less valid until those problems have been solved. That will do no good whatsoever. So it is, of course, no surprise to see that stance being advocated in The Guardian.